A quarter century ago, there was a game called Slave Zero for the Dreamcast, and the critics hated it. It was the kind of game that had a lot of potential, yet squandered all of it with bad gameplay and levels that were an absolute chore to fight through. Now comes Slave Zero X, a side-scrolling beat-em-up set in the same dystopian world as that 1999 Dreamcast game. This is a chance for a new developer to come along and actually improve on the much-maligned franchise's reputation. And does it do that? Spoiler alert, it does not. Trust me, we have a lot to go over in this review of Slave Zero X. No, this is not a side-scrolling demake of the Dreamcast title, but rather a prequel set just a few years before the events of that game. It's a futuristic dystopia where living machines known as slaves control Mega City with an iron fist, making life for everyday citizens miserable. But Show has a plan to end the suffering and take back the city, but it requires some out-of-the-box thinking. You see, by merging with a stolen slave prototype unit, Show hopes to find the power and strength to defeat the Sovereign Khan once and for all, setting up the events for that 1999 game. Although a bit on the silly side, the story is actually the best part of this hack-and-slash brawler. The game's filled with cheesy voice acting and over-the-top boss characters that feel like they were plucked straight out of the 1990s. In fact, that's where a lot of this game feels like it came from. Using a 2.5D perspective, this is a side-scroller where 2D characters fight through a bunch of low-res 3D stages. The whole thing reminds me of the kind of game that you would have seen on the PlayStation in 1996. Honestly, that premise alone completely won me over. Sure, the 2D characters don't exactly look natural in the 3D world, but the spirit was there, and at first glance it reminded me of Strider 2 and other classic action games from that era. I was ready for a good throwback game, and you don't see a lot of games like this on the market anymore. Between the story, the dystopian level designs, and the cool bosses, I couldn't wait to get my hands on Slave Zero X. Oh, boy was that a mistake, because this game is awful. It's the kind of bad that leaves you mad and frustrated. Not because the game is too hard, though the difficulty is definitely a problem, but rather because it's obvious that a lot of time and effort went into creating this world and the bosses that control it. It also has intriguing gameplay mechanics that are deep and require players to do a lot more than simply button mash. Even the enemy designs are pretty cool, especially in the second half when more of the horror elements start to creep in. All of this should have worked, but it doesn't. Not even a little bit. Let's just start at the beginning. Instead of teaching you the mechanics as you play, this is the kind of game that expects you to memorize several pages of complicated instructions before you even have a chance to control the character. That might be fine if you're playing Pac-Man and the only thing you need to know is how to navigate around a simple maze, but this is a game that is filled with mechanics and moves that aren't immediately obvious to the player. And it's not like you can just pause the game and revisit those poorly written instructions, because for whatever reason, those pages are only found at the beginning of the game. This left me with so many gameplay questions as I played the game, both big and small. I eventually just bit the bullet and started the game all over again, figuring that maybe those pages of instructions would actually make more sense now that I've played the game. That helped. But the game's vagueness still left me in the dark on a lot of the things that I could and couldn't do. And it's not like the game eases you in and gently ramps up the difficulty. Oh no. This is one of those games that throws you in the deep end and hopes that you know how to swim. Believe it or not, one of the most challenging opponents in this entire game is a mini-boss character that you're introduced to really early on. This is the type of character that basically takes 1,000 hits to kill, all while his attacks do significantly more damage. Yeah, he's the type of character where he's still challenging even after you've maxed out all your stats. So you can just imagine how helpless you feel when you've barely had enough time to upgrade one or two things. Oh, and did I mention that he shows up a lot? Not only is he a mini-boss on the train in the second stage, but he shows up just a few minutes later in the exact same level, now with a dog. There isn't even a save between those two fights, so if you have to start the stage over for whatever reason, you'll end up having to fight him twice in a row. And then, multiple times in basically every stage going forward. I'm serious, he's used almost like a speed bump. Just when the game is becoming too much fun, here comes that one mini-boss just to keep you frustrated. Hey, remember when I just mentioned starting the level over again? Well, you're gonna have to do that. A lot. I cannot stress this enough, but Slave 0X is quite possibly the most broken game that I've ever reviewed. So broken, in fact, that there were multiple points where I was convinced that I would not be able to beat this game. Not because it was too difficult or anything, but rather because it kept crashing on me. And it's not just that the game crashes constantly, but rather that every time it crashes, you lose more and more money and progress. There was one crash where I lost at least 45 minutes of progress, going from $45,000 in spending money all the way down to just a few hundred. Believe it or not, one of the most consistent ways to crash the game was to use the shop to buy anything. I'd say that the game crashed about 80% of the time that I would go to upgrade my character, often robbing me of the money that I was trying to use on the upgrades. Let me tell you, if there was an 80% chance that you'd get into a crash every time you drove, you would never get into a car. So you can understand why I was hoarding $45,000. I was simply too scared to actually spend that cash on upgrades, which in turn made every other aspect of this game more challenging. Of course, it doesn't help that the game starts to crash outside of the upgrade shop too. The truth is, I could create an hour-long video that is nothing more than the game crashing on me. Yeah, it happened that much. In fact, the game crashed on me so many times that I started to see errors that I've never even seen before. It's almost as if Slave 0X had to invent new crash screens just to keep us on our toes. And when it's not crashing, it's breaking in a lot of other terrible ways. I routinely ran into the problem where I would get stuck outside of the environment and not have a way back in. The only thing I could do is just run around and see the sides of the levels that were supposed to be off limits. One of the weirdest bugs happened when I tried to continue from a checkpoint, only to have the game think that I beat that level and not let me proceed. I literally couldn't leave the mission complete screen, and I had to reset the game and start the level all over from the start. Look, this is one of those games that is so broken that it overshadows everything else. In those fleeting moments when it's not crashing on me, I actually had a good time hacking and slashing. But the moment I start to have actual fun with Slave 0, the game breaks. It's never able to build any momentum because there's always something getting in the way of a good time. And that's a shame, because I wanted to like the 32-bit style, the cool dystopian world building, the colorful bosses, and even the beat-em-up gameplay. All of this should have come together to create a game that improves on the much-maligned original and restores the Slave 0 name. Ugh, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I'd rather play the terrible Dreamcast game. It's not that I'm necessarily disappointed in the Slave 0 prequel, but rather that I'm actively angry at it. This was a chance to actually improve on the original game's terrible reputation. Yet if anything, this bug-ridden throwback brawler actually made things worse. There were times when I spent more time watching the game crash on me than actually playing it. And in the rare times I could get any momentum going, I was annoyed by the repetitive enemies and the mid-level bosses. Look, it's clear that a lot of time went into making Slave 0X, and that effort is completely overshadowed by a mountain of game-breaking bugs. This is not how you revive a franchise 25 years later. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is the most broken game you've ever played? Look, I get it. It's 2024, and games being broken at launch is just the norm. But let me tell you, it's rare for a game to be this broken. I'm honestly excited to hear your horror stories in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a review of Dead End City, Pop Slingers, and more. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.